Good morning to you all. We are today starting the last meeting of our Lab of Tourism and Sustainability Studies. Today, we are very happy to host Professor Richard Sharpley from the University of Central Lancashire, and we are very glad that you accepted our invitation to be with us.
It's a great pleasure to be here.
Thank you very much, Professor. Mozart is signing to us that it is not working yet. For me, it says it's live already.
Okay, I'm trying to access the link here and unavailable. I don't know. Should we ask someone or should we go on with the presentation?
You should ask someone. It's okay.
It is okay.
It is.
If it's working, but for me, Mozart, it is saying that it's live. It's working.
Yeah, I have a message on my screen saying live on YouTube.
Yeah, it is. So I think we can move on. Can we?
Okay.
So I would like to say a very warm welcome to all of our researchers who are here with us today. We are the Laboratory of Studies in Tourism and Sustainability, based in the Center for Sustainable Development Studies of the University of Brasilia. And we are very glad. My name is Helena Costa. I'm a coordinator of the group together with Professor João Tasso. And we are very happy today to host our last meeting of this such hard year for us all. But we have this opportunity, and we were just talking about it right now, how important it is to us to have the chance to discuss and bring new ideas together. And Professor Sharpley gently accepted our invitation to be with us today online. And all the subjects that we are going to talk about today are very important to our group and our center. We are going to cover a discussion on tourism, sustainable development, and the theoretical divide, taking 20 years of this discussion to today. Our conversation today with Professor Sharpley will be based in a very recent paper that he published in the Journal of Sustainable Tourism. And we are very, very happy to host this conversation together with our research group, together with Ghg, which is a research group based in the university, the Federal University of Rio Grande do Norte, up in the Northeast region of Brazil. So I would like to thank you all. Thank you, Professor Sharpley. And I know that you don't need, it is a guest that doesn't need introduction, but just to say a very few words. Professor Sharpley is a very preeminent professor of tourism studies in worldwide, I would say. He's based in the UK, and he discussed a lot about tourism, development, rural enterprises, and dark tourism. So we welcome you very happy today. He is a professor in the Business School of Lancashire, and he's going to share with us today his thoughts about tourism, sustainable development, and the theoretical divide. Thank you very much, Professor. We will be happy to listen to your presentation.
Helena, thank you very much indeed for that very generous and kind introduction. As I said before, it is a great pleasure to be talking to you today. And you know, before everybody joined us, one of the things we were talking about is that the one benefit that has emerged from the COVID crisis is that we're all learning now to communicate using Zoom and Teams and everything else. And so in some ways, this crisis has brought the world closer together in terms of our ability to talk, because a year ago, I would never have considered probably doing this. So yeah, it's a great pleasure to be here. So what I intend to do, I have a short presentation. It's not technical. It's more of an overview of some of my ideas, really. And Helena, if you could share the screen. I apologise to everybody. I couldn't share this presentation on my screen, so Helena will be sharing it. And thank you very much.
It's working?
Yeah.
Do you see it? Okay.
I will ask you to, every time I need a new slide, Helena, I'll ask you to do so. So we hope this works. Just by way of introduction, as most of you probably know, I've been thinking about and writing about the relationship between tourism and development, probably since I started as an academic, which was now 30 years ago. 20 years ago, I published a paper called Tourism and Sustainable Development, the Theoretical Divide. That was actually based on my PhD, which I did during the 1990s. And that really, in that PhD, I set out to argue that there was no such thing as sustainable tourism development by exploring, the theoretical concept of sustainable development. I suppose by definition, if there's no such thing as sustainable tourism development, you could then argue also that there's no such thing as sustainable development. Anyway, my position hasn't really changed. If anything, my ideas have become more hardened about this relationship between tourism and sustainable development. So as Helena mentioned, I was invited by Xavier Font, who's one of the editors of the Journal of Sustainable Tourism, to revisit the original paper. And so I was privileged to write and have published a 20 years on paper. And that was published a few months ago in JOS, in the Journal of Sustainable Tourism. So the ideas presented in that paper, and they are really just ideas, that they're the basis of discussion, particularly around this idea of degrowth. That's really what I'm going to sort of talk about now. So Helena, if we could have the next slide, please. Fantastic. What I'm going to do is take you back 30 years to when I started as a tourism academic. Now, some of you will remember this. I think you're probably all much younger than me. But when I started as an academic in tourism, the world of tourism was very different. And these are just some of the ways it was different. International arrivals were very limited. We're now up to 1.5 billion. Certainly, we didn't benefit from the technology, the communication technology we have today. There was no internet, no smart technology. I don't know if you can see me, but now we travel with the mobile phone. That was impossible. Traveling was much more adventurous, much more exciting, and sometimes much more challenging. Much more limited range of products, experiences. Possibly a good thing there were no lost carriers, low cost carriers. I'll come back to this later, but to me, one of the biggest challenges facing the future of tourism has been the development of cheap, low cost, no frills airlines, which now represent about 30% of all international travel. That's been a huge problem in sustainability terms. Most holidays we bought through high street travel agents. We used to travel with travelers' checks. One or two people might remember those. There were no credit cards or debit cards. Could you just click, please, Helena? I think there's a thing on the bottom of this slide. Is it going to come up? There we go. But one thing...
I'm sorry.
No, can you go back again? Back to the last slide. That's it. But one thing that hasn't changed over the last 30 years has been our academic focus on the impacts of tourism and sustainable tourism development. The concept of sustainable tourism development emerged in around 1990. In fact, I think one of the very first references to it was at a conference in 1990. And we still have it today. Both at the academic level, we're writing, talking about sustainable tourism or sustainable tourism development. It's up there in global development policies. Tourism is very much linked to the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. Quite controversially, I think, tourism is seen as a means of achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. But also one thing that for me hasn't changed over the last 20 or 30 years has been my concerns, my criticisms, if you like, of sustainable tourism development. And I think I highlight these on the next slide, please, Helena. There we go. These are the kind of things that I argued about in the paper 20 years ago, and also came back to in the more recent paper. The problems or the concerns or if you like, the criticisms of sustainable tourism development which I think will be familiar to all of you. The very concept of sustainable development and tourism development is its ambiguity. It can mean anything to anybody. It can be exploited or attached to any particular form of social or economic activity you wish, and it's called sustainable. So it doesn't really mean anything. It's very malleable. You can attach it to all sorts of contexts, which on the one hand makes it very attractive. It's also, you know, very politically attractive sort of concept. You can't argue against the concept of sustainable development, because why would you? But that kind of the fact that it is so ambiguous and so malleable means that its true meaning is diminished. Its impact is really diminished. Also, by focusing on sustainable development, by delusional, what I mean there is that if we believe, or if we set out all these policies for sustainable development, sustainable tourism development, that by implication means that we believe we can achieve it. There is an argument that we're deluding ourselves by focusing on this, because it is, from my perspective, an unachievable objective, sustainable development. Certainly more in terms of tourism, as I argued in the paper 20 years ago, there is a lack of fit between tourism and the parental paradigm of sustainable development. The manner in which tourism is developed, is promoted, the manner in which tourism operates in the real world does not fit well within the objectives, the policies, and the philosophy of sustainable development. There's the gap between the two. And particularly in terms of tourism, and when we talk about sustainable development or sustainable tourism, because of this difficulty in linking or fitting tourism to sustainable development, in other words, sustainable tourism development, what most people talk about today is sustainable tourism, not sustainable tourism development. And this is a really important distinction. So there's this very parochial, inward, tourism-centric interpretation of sustainable tourism development, essentially trying to make tourism itself sustainable, ignoring the wider developmental contribution of tourism. And of course, there are many, you know, I'll be the first to admit there are lots of sustainable tourism developments. There are lots of little projects around the world which within themselves are sustainable, eco-lodges, and which, you know, they use recycled rainwater, the solar panels, they employ local people, all the kind of things you would expect. But that's at the destinational level. It's missing the wider picture, which really, if you are going to achieve sustainable tourism development, or sustainable tourism even, it must be at the global level. You cannot look at tourism in anything but the global context, particularly when we're talking about climate change, which I'll come to in a moment. So in a sense, that what is promoted and still promoted as sustainable tourism is a micro, it's a small local solution to a global macro problem. And there is still this divide between academic theory and practice. So could we have the next slide, please, now, Helena? And so the paper that I wrote in 2000, this was the conclusion I came to of that, is that, yes, we should seek more sustainable forms of tourism by definition. You know, if tourism is to survive into the future and to contribute in terms of economic growth to destinations, we have to seek ways of making tourism itself sustainable, environmentally more benign. But I believe then, I argued then, and I still argue now, that it is inappropriate to try and develop tourism under the banner, under the flag of sustainable development. There's this big divide, and I'll explain why in the next slide, please, Helena. Because, quite simply, and I summarize these in the paper published earlier this year, just look at the figures. Since 2000, we've had all these policies for sustainable development and sustainable tourism development, should I say. But these have been continuing until this year, of course. There's been, you know, exponential continuing growth in international tourism. International tourism alone is 1.5 billion arrivals in 2019. If you look at some countries, when you look at their domestic tourism markets, which often gets forgotten about, but it's equally important in terms of looking at the impacts of tourism and climate change. In China, there are something like 5 billion domestic trips every year, far, far greater than all international tourism. A lot of that is flying, a lot of that is driving. It's all contributing to climate change and global warming. We've had the emergence of new markets. More than 30 destinations now receive more than 10 million visitors a year. That is unsustainable in any sense. That's underpinned by the emergence of new markets. And globally, and this comes round to the degrowth argument in a moment, is that the growth in tourism has been underpinned by liberalisation, cheaper transport costs, and what I refer to as the logic of the market, which is basically you provide cheaper services, more and more people are going to buy those services. And one of the key challenges, or one of the key issues within that, has been low-cost travel, that particularly the low-cost airlines that have made a huge contribution to the growth of tourism, but also a huge contribution to global warming. Also, in an unsustainable sense, tourism is becoming increasingly important as an agent of development. More and more places have become totally dependent upon tourism as a source of economic growth and development, which has sadly been evidenced by the problems of the COVID crisis. Many destinations are now suffering economically very badly because of the complete collapse of tourism. And despite what Harold Goodwin might say with his responsible tourism ideas, I witness no evidence of widespread adoption of responsible tourist behaviour. Most of us consume tourism irresponsibly, and we can probably talk about that later. And also, of course, the most recent evidence of a problem has been so-called over-tourism. I don't like the term over-tourism. It's a very trendy term. This, of course, was pre-COVID-19. But I think over-tourism is a kind of euphemism, a sort of a trendy term which really hides the real problem of tourism, which is excessive growth, which I'll come to in a moment. Could we have the next slide, please, Helena? And of course, the main thing, the biggest challenge, and this is really what's focused my thinking about degrowth, is the challenge of climate change and global warming. Next slide, please. I'm sure most of you have seen this particular slide before. The blue on that graph are current projections for the growth in Ghg emissions if there is no change in policy. And the way things that are looking at the moment is that we're not going to achieve the desired reductions in global warming by 2030. I've seen a few programs, certainly over here in the West, where on television, where it's claimed we've already reached the tipping point, that the problems emerging from global warming are becoming irreversible. But of course, tourism is contributing, or is one of the major contributions to global warming through fossil fuel-based travel. Next slide, please. So that fundamental problem, I believe, and it's one that's reflected in development policies generally, as well as in tourism, is the continuing focus on economic growth. Nations around the world as a home, as a whole, still is based on the idea that progress can be measured in economic growth as measured in gross domestic product. And interesting, when we look at the Sustainable Development Goals and the original Brundtland report on sustainable tourism back in 1987, growth, economic growth, is fundamental, quite controversially and contradictorily in my view. Economic growth is fundamental to all the policies for sustainable development more generally. And again, we can talk about this in a moment, but I fail to see how continuing economic growth can be seen as appropriate in a world where we need to actually sustain all our natural resources. And of course, growth is widely reflected in UNWTO policies, a lot of national policies. A colleague of mine did some research in Europe recently. Every European country's tourism development policy has the primary objective of growth. It's fundamental to growth. Next slide, please, Helena. And just again, you'll have seen this. I think this is from one of the World Tourism Organization's annual reports. But that's their projected growth up to 2030. And I guess irrespective of this year and all the hopes for a more sustainable tourism post-COVID, the evidence from Europe and the reactions to the opening up of some countries in Europe over the summer is that tourism growth will continue. What I tend to do is I like to match this slide with the one before last, the two graphs, because essentially these are two UN linked organizations. You have the UNWTO celebrating that green line, that growth in tourism, which seems to contradict totally with the blue line on the global warming graph, the emissions graph. They totally contradict each other. Next slide, please. So this is a very, I shan't linger on this. Could you click a couple of times to bring up some other things which go on there? That's it, fantastic. Oh, back one, sorry, Helena. Too many, that's it. This is a very simplistic idea of the economic growth model, but this is as relevant to tourism as general economic policies in general. The world is based on producing higher output to meet increased demand or to stimulate increased demand. Higher output feeds into increased investment, which leads to higher productivity. That in turn leads to increased wages. It's this virtuous circle, if you like, of economic growth, which is the basis of capitalism. It's the basis of the neoliberal economy. But to achieve this, to achieve continuing economic growth, and in tourism as in the economy more generally, we need innovation. We need new products to attract new customers. This is why we have a new iPhone every year. We don't actually need to buy a new iPhone every year, but it's just a way of increasing demand. That innovation will lead to a growth in demand, which feeds into higher productivity and higher production. But of course, it's also based on the belief that having more, having wealth equals happiness. Now, this is another debate we can possibly have in a moment. A lot of research shows and has shown that beyond a certain basic level, wealth does not necessarily lead to greater happiness. And then increasingly, there is evidence that continuing economic growth actually leads to what I call de-development or social recession. It doesn't lead to continual benefits. Economic growth is also dependent on a liberal market-led economy, of course, but it is also, and this is the main issue, dependent upon an infinite supply of resources, which of course doesn't exist. There is not an infinite supply of natural non-renewable resources. So the technocentrics amongst us would argue, well, that's not a problem because through technological growth or advance, we can achieve absolute or relative decoupling. But again, there are arguments against that. It is highly unlikely that we can decouple production in any sense, whether it's in tourism or anything, from resource use. Because if we do one of the arguments is greater efficiencies will actually lead to greater demand. Next slide, please. Almost finished, and then we can have our discussion. These are the problems with growth, of course. Sorry, we'll come up these slowly. Continuing growth is, by definition, environmentally unsustainable. Overproduction result in the unsustainable exploitation of resources, the unsustainable use of the global sink function, in other words, pollution in the atmosphere, and so on and so forth. So globally, there is a need to reduce the rate of growth of consumption, particularly in wealthier societies, but actually also to allow other societies to catch up, particularly to address climate change. There's long been arguments for a steady state economy, and I would agree with that fundamentally. Next slide, please. This is really just to make us all feel guilty about our travel. I don't know if any of you have seen this particular slide before, but in terms of CO2 emissions, the richest 10% of the world's population we are responsible for almost half of total lifestyle consumption emissions. If you, I'm not sure what the exact figures are, but if you highlight tourism, and particular flying within that, that 50% of emissions, or that 10%. What is particularly alarming is that roughly 10 or 11% of the global population actually fly. 90% roughly don't fly. That in itself means that only 10% of the population are contributing a relatively significant proportion of CO2 emissions through flying, of overall emissions. More alarming is the fact that of those 10% of the global population who fly, the great majority is accounted for by frequent flyers. The figure is around, I don't know, 60%, something like that. I'm not sure of the exact figure. But something like 60% of all flights are accounted for by a very small percentage, 5 or 6, 10% of all flyers, frequent flyers. So there's a very small percentage of the global population making a huge contribution to global CO2 emissions. That's a really important point. Next slide, please. And the problem with growth, apart from the overproduction and overconsumption, click again, please. And again, there should be some more. In addition to environmental exploitation, the degradation and the reduction in environmental resources, economic growth, although fundamental to development at a basic level, all societies need a fundamental level of wealth and income to meet basic needs and to provide social goods. As countries become wealthier, as economic growth continues, in most countries, what this is revealed in is greater inequality and increasing social problems. Economic growth in itself is not a panacea. It doesn't lead to nirvana. It doesn't lead to long-term happiness. Continuing economic growth is leading to other social problems in terms of drug abuse, family breakdown, anxieties, a whole range of social problems suffered primarily in the wealthier Western world. Can you click again, please, Elena? And what that is also related to, and I think I referred to it in my most recent paper, is that progress and development itself is very narrowly thought of, very narrowly interpreted or defined, more often than not about having more, being wealthier, being better off. So part of what my argument is about is we need to reassess what it means to be developed, what it means to achieve well-being, what it means to have a meaningful existence, which is decoupled, if you like, from simply economic wealth. Next slide, please. And so to try and achieve or to move towards a more sustainable world, but also perhaps a world that is happier in the sense of well-being, is a reduction in both production and consumption on the global scale. But that needs to be accompanied with, and this is the big challenge, of course, a shift in society's understanding of the relationship between consumption, wealth and well-being. Next, please, Elena. The question is, can we achieve degrowth in tourism? It might have been on one of the previous slides, but I coined a term, obesity of experience. One of the problems with tourism, I think, is that, particularly in the Western world, we are consuming far too much tourism. That minority of us who are traveling around, polluting the atmosphere, clogging up the cities around the world, places like Barcelona, Venice, with over-tourism. We are, in a sense, becoming obese on the consumption of experiences, just as in many Western countries, physical obesity is becoming a problem amongst larger proportion of the population. That idea can also be transferred to experience, the consumption of experiences. We have too much of it. So in order to reduce tourism's carbon footprint, there is a need, I believe, to degrow, reduce the amount we are traveling, particularly through air travel, through any fossil fuel-based travel. But the question is how, and I think this is what we will probably be talking about now. How can we achieve this degrowth in tourism? Will there be voluntary adoption of more sustainable lifestyles, more sustainable tourism? We've seen the beginnings of Flugskam, the movement against flying in Scandinavia, but that is very small scale. Is there a potential for global agreement or even regulation, which I feel is the answer? Difficult to achieve, but it needs to come. And of course, there is a need, I would accept, to balance global degrowth in tourism with local and national development. There are many countries in the world which need tourism still, which depend on tourism for their development. I'm talking about countries which are less developed than the Western countries. But at the same time, there is probably potential in many Western countries with very large tourism sectors to actually degrow that tourism sector without too much significant impact on their economy. Next slide, if there is one. No, that's the end of it. So that's the end of the slide. Thank you. I couldn't remember if there was a final concluding slide or not. So thank you for listening. That was probably around the 20-25 minutes as requested. So if Helena, you can bring all our faces back now. All
right. Yeah, thank you very much, Richard.
There we go.
Very, very good presentation, very clear, and a very nice historic approach from the 90s on this topic that we are all very interested in it. Well, I've a lot of questions, but because it's my topic. No, I've been writing on tourism development and sustainable tourism for a while. But before that, I would like to ask if any of you that are watching from Zoom have any questions, if any of you want to say something, or can I just start with the questions? Okay. Yeah. I think I would like you to clarify, mainly for those who are not very familiar with that discussion in the 90s, please. Why tourism scholars started to detach the concept of sustainable tourism to the broader sustainable development, and why that? I think this is okay. Thanks.
Yeah, it's. I think the quick answer, and I'll give you a quick answer and then a slightly longer answer. The quick answer is probably because subconsciously they realize that the achievement of sustainable tourism development, in other words, the achievement of sustainable development through tourism, which is how it was originally conceptualized back in 1990, was impossible. They probably realized that, and they said, oh, well, we still have to make tourism sustainable, so let's just talk about sustainable tourism, which is a much simpler idea. It's more tangible. How can we look at ways of making tourism itself more sustainable at the destination level? It's easier to conceptualize, and it is, in some respects, possible. It is achievable. The longer sort of answer is that back in 1990, when the concept of sustainable tourism development first emerged, that of course was at the time that sustainable development itself was becoming really popular and global as a development paradigm. We'd had the Brundtland Report in 1987, which everybody bought into. We had Agenda 21. Sustainable development was the flavor of the decade, if you like. And of course, tourism bought into that. And the reason that tourism bought into it was sort of the natural progression from concerns with the impacts of tourism from the 1970s probably onwards through to the fascination with this so-called alternative tourism in the 1980s, which emerged, alternative tourism, alternative to mass tourism. And so it was perceived that this idea of sustainable tourism development was it was the panacea, it was the answer to the problems of mass tourism. But of course, the problems of tourism aren't just mass tourism, it's the problems of all tourism. So there was this belief, I guess, that sustainable tourism development, the answer lay in sustainable tourism development. But I think there has always been this huge misunderstanding of what sustainable tourism development is all about, which is about tourism, as I said a moment ago, contributing to sustainable development. I've just actually finished writing a small paper for somewhere else that, it's arguable whether tourism leads to development in its own right, sustainable or otherwise, when you're trying to understand what development is. So I think the problem was that tourism academics overlook the fact that essentially tourism is a source or a vehicle of economic growth. Beyond that, its contribution to development, whether that development is sustainable or otherwise, is dependent upon so many factors, so many external influencing factors beyond tourism, whether it's local development policies, local society, all sorts of things, that there is no inevitability about tourism leading to sustainable development. And I think it was the realization of that that focused academics' minds on sustaining tourism, sustainable tourism itself. So that's the short answer and the long answer.
Okay. Yeah, well, we have, thank you for your answer. I think this is, I could keep on talking about it forever, but we have two people who want to say and to ask you a question. So perhaps I think for the dynamics of our talk, perhaps we could, what do you prefer? We listen to one question and then you answer, or we can arrange a set of questions and then you can answer them all.
It's probably one question at a time, because if we have a set of questions, I'll probably forget.
All right. Okay. So yeah, so we will change a little bit to the way we use it to do that. So now Elena is asking to ask a question. So okay. Please, Elena.
Thank you very much, Professor Mozart. And people have just told me now that we have missed in YouTube our first introduction. So I feel I should come back a little step again and thank Professor Sharpley for being here with us today and allowing us from LETS, from CDS, from GPOT, who are the research groups and the center. We are based in the University of Brasilia, CDS. We are always very worried and discussing about these subjects you bring to us today. So we had the chance to talk a little bit about in the beginning, but unfortunately it was not available for everyone. So I would like to thank you and to thank all my colleagues, the researchers who are here with us today. I would like to thank Professor Elimar, who has joined us, for being the one who put us together back in 2006 for studying tourism and sustainable development and sustainability and make us think about it. And he also is the one that keeps us thinking about degrowth. So it is a very special moment for us to put together here tourism and the ideas of sustainability and degrowth. So thank you, Professor, for allowing us today and inviting us in this paper to rethink and search for new ways for balancing this consumption and production of tourism. I think this is the main point of your paper, that is thinking and make us a bit more critical about this production and consumption. So having said that, when I was reading your paper, I had I have to show you, I have a notebook that I had 10, 12 questions, but trying to be brief. I would like to hear your thoughts about a point that keeps in my mind. When you say about concentration and dependence on tourism, at the same time, I keep thinking about places. Of course, we know, and in Brazil, we face the problems of having, for example, agriculture as a monoculture. And we don't want tourism to be a monoculture too. Sure. But there are some places we go to work with them, some territories, some destinations where we go there and we see that tourism could be possibly a better solution than, let's say, for instance, mining. And I have lots of colleagues here that are studying these conflicts between tourism and some other activities in the destination. So I would like to hear your thoughts about these conflicts when tourism can be the good guy, if I can say that.
Yeah, I mean, I would be it's a really good question, actually, and what you're pointing to is the complexity of the whole issue. You know, for me to say we have to degrow tourism straight, it's oversimplistic, it's unrealistic, and it's to deny what I would also agree to be the good side of tourism. Tourism is a good thing. You know, and we could all name many destinations around the world that have benefited significantly from tourism. Many countries have developed significantly and well from tourism. One country I've done a lot of research on in the past was Cyprus, the island of Cyprus, which essentially from 1974 was transformed from a developing country into the third richest island in the Mediterranean through tourism. It's a good thing. And particularly when you are comparing or assessing tourism as a developmental agent against other industries, whether it's large-scale mining, perhaps in parts of Brazil, I don't know it too well, but one of the things that's publicized very much over here is the widespread destruction of the rainforest, for example. The kind of developments which are environmentally destructive. Tourism is often seen as a much more benign, not smokeless, but it is a more benign sector. Now the whole point about sustainable tourism development, as it was originally conceptualized, that tourism should be considered as a developmental option alongside other industries, other sectors, other economic sectors, and it still should be. And so there's actually nothing wrong with trying to develop tourism in those places where it might be less environmentally destructive than other sectors. It should be promoted. But then comes the question, well, what sort of tourism? How are the tourists going to get there? Can the income from tourism replace the income lost from not having the other sector? Now, unfortunately, around the world, despite all the efforts for quality versus quantity, small level, ecotourism, etc., there is always a tendency to move into the growth mode. This ecotourism has been very successful. Let's get some more ecotourists and let's build it up. So it's achieving that balance. But it also has to be considered within, for example, developments in transport. Within Europe, for example, there is huge potential over the next 10, 15, 20 years to develop an intra-European, low environmental impact, high-speed rail network, which means that tourism could function very nicely, environmentally benignly, traveling by land. So taking all those things into account, there's actually no reason why tourism shouldn't continue. My main concern is flying at the moment. It's the impacts of global impacts of ever increasing growth in air transport. That is the major contributor to global warming, and that is what has to be reduced. So I think, does that answer your question, Helena? Sort of. You've gone quiet. I can't hear you, I'm afraid.
I'm sorry. Thank you very much, Professor. I think it's a brilliant point. I would just like to take just a second to say a small hello to my friends in Portuguese. Can I do that?
Please
just
do.
To say, just excuse us for a second. So, pessoal, eu queria só fazer cumprimento a todos em português também. Então, todo mundo que está nos acompanhando pelo YouTube, todos os pesquisadores que estão aqui hoje conosco. Hoje é um evento que a gente está fazendo em inglês para ser possível, né, manter uma conversa com o nosso convidado. Então, a gente pode receber também pelo YouTube perguntas, se a pessoa quiser mandar em português ou em inglês. Se for em português, a gente vai tentar traduzir aqui rapidinho. E então a gente está recebendo perguntas do grupo, aqui pelo Zoom e também pelo YouTube. Muito obrigada por todos e todas que estão nos acompanhando hoje, e a gente vai seguir com o debate com a mediação do professor Mozart. Please, Mozart, can you keep the mediation of the debate? Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks. We have a few questions from YouTube, and João has also enrolled to ask a question. So I think, João, is it okay if I ask first the questions from YouTube and then I call you?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so because the questions from YouTube are interesting and they are related. The first question by our colleague André was, how can we contribute to researchers on nature tourism in Brazil to improve tourism contribution to biodiversity, local populations, and climate? And I would like to add a question made by Bruna Fernandes about the, because it has to do with the implementation of this idea of degrowth, but she's concerned with the politics and interests in local levels and mainly in developing countries. Is that, and indeed, the tourism institutions, they are quite dominated by a business stock. So when it goes to local levels, it gets even more important, the interests of local enterprise, tourism enterprise, and so on. So isn't it, and I can see, just to add a little bit more, there was a group of Dutch researchers that launched a whole idea during the pandemic about degrowth. And even in the Netherlands, where they have very highly thought on green issues and environmental planning and things like that, they couldn't do it. So I can imagine like these fragile communities in the Amazon forest, local levels, and this local politics. So have you thought about this, or can you comment a little bit on this local level politics?
I mean, what those questions point to are all sorts of issues. One of them is the distinction between, because when I talk about, or what I think about degrowth in terms of tourism at the global level, there has to be, somehow we have to work towards a balance of where you're degrowing and at what level, and what we're talking about degrowth. And what I envisage is degrowth in tourism, particularly through flying, in those areas which essentially receive far more tourists than they probably need. So I'm essentially talking about major European destinations, North American destinations, the over-tourism destinations. And those kind of destinations can afford a reduction in tourism. But yes, it comes down to local politics. Of course, the classic example, or the one that everybody usually refers to, is Venice. Now, Venice, for as long as I can remember, for as long as I've been an academic, there have been calls, there have been policies, there have been movements to reduce tourism to Venice, because Venice is collapsing through tourism, particularly all the cruise ships. I remember going to a conference 25 years ago about Save Venice from tourism. And the big problem in Venice has been, as you mentioned, local politics, local economic interests. And Venice as a city has resisted all attempts to try and reduce the level of tourism because of the power of local businesses. They say, we're going to lose business. I think things will change in Venice now, because there has been the threat of them losing their World Heritage status if they don't do something about tourism. So there is a conflict between local politics and global interest, particularly in terms of UNESCO. In terms of in countries like South America, though, degrowth shouldn't be considered a threat or not necessarily even a policy in terms of South America and tourism in South America, because I'm not familiar with it, but I would imagine local community-based tourism developments that would be of benefit to communities throughout South America and Brazil. There is no reason why they cannot be encouraged and supported and developed. The degrowth idea that I have is overall trying to reduce the growth in tourism internationally, but not at every destinational level. So it is, in a sense, trying to share out tourism on a global basis between those destinations, those countries, those communities that still need tourism and can develop it at a local level in a reasonably sustainable way. Whereas at the same time, trying to degrow tourism in those destinations, those countries, those communities, which have an excess of tourism. And there are countries and destinations all around the world which have an excess of tourism and could actually withstand a reduction in their tourism. Does that sort of answer the question? I had this sort of vision of a sharing out of an overall reduction in the level of tourism globally, but at the same time within that, shifting the share, if you like, of tourism to those countries that need it, away from those destinations and the countries that don't need it. It's very similar to a wider argument about consumption and production more generally. Most policies, most sustainable policies now recognise that we need to degrow more generally, not only in tourism, but of course growth, economic growth and development is necessary in many countries, and so in my view what is required is a rebalancing of the global economy, whereby the richer, wealthier countries degrow because we overconsume and overproduce, but at the same time we need to allow or support, sorry, it sounds very arrogant to say allow, we need to support those countries, developing countries, to continue growing, to continue developing, so that all the countries, we balance in the middle somewhere. Those countries which are consuming, producing too much need to degrow, but those countries which still need to develop need to continue to grow to meet in a global, equitable, just level of development.
All right, thank you. Yeah, you definitely responded to the question with a very, a difficult thing, because we don't know how to anticipate it. So do we have to wait until we have over tourism to start fighting it? But this is I don't know.
Well, sorry to interrupt, but I mean, over tourism is really interesting. I mean, in many senses, over tourism is nothing new. I mean, I remember when I first started studying that there's part of England called the Lake District. It's a very famous national park. And even in the 1960s, they were worried about what we now call over tourism in the 1960s. So 60 years ago, because the 1960s in this country was when car ownership grew very, very rapidly. And so all the policies in the Lake District, the national park, were saying, how are we going to prevent over-tourism? They didn't call it over-tourism. So it's not a new problem. It's the response is new, though. The unique thing, in my view, about over-tourism is the community responses, the anti-tourism movement. It's destinations themselves saying, whoa, we've had enough. We know the reasons why. It's because of Airbnb and all the other influences. But it's the very fact that local communities are now saying, we've had enough, we don't want all this tourism. And that's intriguing. And I think in some respects, that's where the answer might lie. But it's only whether people themselves who are complaining about too many tourists in their town, will they then extend their thinking to their own consumption and their own behaviors? And that's the challenge.
All right, thank you. Professor João Tasso.
Thank you, Professor Mozart. Thank you so much, Professor Richard. It's a great pleasure to have you here. Great pleasure to meet you now virtually. First of all, thank you for this incredible opportunity for all of us. We really want you to know that your work has inspired a large part of our laboratory members in their research and professional activities. In particular, your work and debates in the field of sustainable tourism helped me a lot during my dissertation and doctoral thesis. So thank you so much for that.
And kind of you to say so. Thank you.
Your recently article is very interesting. In a brilliant way, you returned the debate about the relationship between tourism and sustainable development and the importance of understanding the concepts in a current context. But I have just one question. In my postdoctoral research, I have dedicated myself to understand the need to reincorporate ethics into Brazilian public policies in tourism. And we know that the field of ethics understands that all public policy must be oriented towards a purpose, like a single purpose. It's always the common good and happiness. So, however, for many years, the Brazilian government has set goals to economic growth, increase tourism flow, like in an over-tourism perspective, increase tourist spending and increase jobs. But my question is in a ethic way of thinking, are these the real purpose of tourism? Like, what are the main purpose of tourism? For me, it's very important to understand this conception of tourism. So with your knowledge, if you can help me with this question, what's the main purpose of tourism?
Main purpose of tourism? The main purpose? The main purpose of tourism?
Yeah, the main purpose, yeah.
Well, the main purpose of tourism is what it always has been, because I mean, destinations don't really want tourists. Tourists make a mess, they make noise, they take up space, but tourists have one thing that destinations need, which is dollars. So, you know, that is fundamental. That's one thing you cannot ever forget about tourism. That is the very basis of tourism, is that it's an economic activity. It's based on expenditure. Tourism brings dollars either directly through expenditure. Well, you know this. I'm sorry, but you know, it's through receipts, through foreign investment, whatever it might be. Tourism is about money. And that is the purpose of tourism, fundamentally. The dilemma is how to translate that very basic, fundamental economic function of tourism into development, whatever that might be. And increasingly, I think, you know, if you're talking from an ethical perspective, development needs to be thought of in ethical, moral terms as opposed to purely wealth terms. I mean, I was alluding to this a moment ago in my sort of brief presentation. And so the great challenge, I think, for governments, for policymakers, and for us as consumers is to reassess what we understand, what happiness and well-being is. And I suppose this is the great challenge, particularly for all leaders, you know, whether it's cultural, religious, or political, is to shift the focus from wealth creation, which is necessary to level, to trying to enhance people's understanding of what it means to live a good life, to enjoy well-being, to live a fulfilled life, to live a prosperous life in the traditional sense of having hope for the future, as opposed to prosperous as in economic wealth. So the question then is, can tourism fulfill that purpose? Can tourism, and I don't have the answer. I'm not going to give you an answer. to me, this is the ultimate challenge. It's the ultimate $64,000 question, the ultimate conundrum. How can tourism as an economic sector, which is all it is, how can that contribute to the promotion of happiness, well-being, or development in the broader sense, as opposed to just the economic sense? So that probably doesn't answer your question at all, but I think if you go back to the fundamentals of what tourism is, I suppose the answer is that it comes down to local policy making. You know, tourism brings economic benefits to destinations measured in income, in visitor numbers, in employment, etc., etc. The extent to which that can get translated into a more ethical, well-being directed approach of development then becomes the responsibility of national and local government. It has to be. It's not the responsibility of the tourism sector. They're there to make money. It's the responsibility of local policymakers, local national government, how they utilize that. And what I've seen over the years is, you know, some countries which attempt to utilize tourism for the benefit of their people, you know, for the benefit of society. I've seen other countries which exploit tourism financially. They milk the cow, but they don't feed it, as one person said to me. You know, they don't invest back in it, and so on and so forth. So it's all about local policy, I think, is how you bridge this link between tourism and fulfilling the purpose that destinations don't have. I mean, any country has to decide what it wants tourism for. You know, it'd be arrogant for me or anybody else to say, you know, Brazil should use tourism for this reason and it should develop it in that way. Every destination, every society has to decide how it wishes to develop, you know, what its objectives and aims are and how tourism can feed into that. But it's at that level where the responsibility lies at the national or local level. Does that answer? A thumbs up, good.
I think Elena wants to make a comment on João's questions in your answer.
I would like just to ask you, Professor Richard, if you would give us any example about a country, if you have seen a country or a destination that has overcome this idea of growth in tourism policies and actually, is it real? Does it exist? We look at an example? Have you seen it before?
You know, I knew you were going to ask me that question, and you know, as I was talking, I bet somebody's going to ask me. You know, and to be honest, I'm struggling. I really am struggling to think of one. I mean, a lot of people in the past, and this is the kind of a reverse answer. One country that used to be held up as a paragon of sustainable, you know, sort of low growth development through tourism, and you probably know what I'm going to say, was Bhutan in the Himalayas. You know, for many years they had they had this idea of gross national happiness as opposed to gross national wealth, you know. And for many, many years that they actually maintained, you know, low levels of tourism, high spend, you know, based on regulation, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, every tourist has to pay, I can't remember, it's $200 a day or so. I can't remember what it is, the exact figures. But now when you look at Bhutan's tourism policies and their growth, you know, what's happening? The dollar, and, you know, and it is growing very, very rapidly. So no, I can't think of any particular country off the top of my head that has managed to achieve purposefully, as opposed to accidentally, a sort of a low or no growth policy in tourism. Some states, I mean, one country, it's not a country, it's a state, Mallorca, for a number of years has tried to, and I think they're moving slowly in the right direction of trying to achieve you know, a more sustainable tourism policy. The other way to talk about no growth or degrowth or slow growth is a shift from quantity to quality. You know, qualitative growth as opposed to quantitative growth. You know, and some destinations Cyprus tried it as well for a time, is to shift from lower spending tourists to a more qualitative, higher spending tourists by improving the quality of the product. You know, that is one practical way, I guess, of achieving, you know, slower growth or degrowth, is replacing, you know, without sounding too, yeah, from a marketing basis, it's low spend, lower grade tourists to higher spend, high grade tourists. You are immediately then falling into ethical debates about equality, the rights of people to enjoy holidays, and all sorts of things. So there is no simple, easy answer. What I suspect is that, you know, over the next 10 to 20 years, given what's happening in international airline operations because of COVID, it's generally agreed that air travel will become more expensive over the next 5 to 10 years. It's accepted that, or recognized and acknowledged that even by 2025, that air travel might be somewhere around 50% more expensive than it was pre-COVID. You know, because we all know, you know, airlines are having to rationalize their operations. Most of them are cutting down their fleet size. They'll be rationalizing where they're flying to, et cetera, et cetera. But business travel is going to collapse. You know, that's one thing that Zoom has been great for, is, you know, making business realize they can have meetings without having to travel around the world. So the business sector of air travel is likely to collapse, or which of course is the big money maker for airlines. So air travel will become more expensive. Even if it goes up 50% though, in real terms, it will still be much cheaper than it was in 30 years ago. I remember, you know, when I traveled internationally in the mid 80s, you know, a one-way ticket from London to New Delhi was £450, you know, which in today's term is £1,000, you know, so it will still be cheaper. But nevertheless, the days of low cost air travel, I truly believe, are numbered. You know, we are going to see a significant increase in price of flying, which in turn will eventually lead to tourism more generally becoming much more expensive. There will be a shift to tourism over time becoming a luxury. And I think that's probably where the international tourism I'm talking about. I genuinely believe that international tourism, for a whole range of reasons, will become, excuse me, a more luxury form of consumption as opposed to the mass form of consumption that it is today. But that's not only on the costs of flying and hotels. There will be, I'm sure, environmental pressure. Sooner or later, you know, the world will actually start imposing some form of financial toll or cost on airlines into an environmental. There'll be some form or another. At the same time, when you start looking at global population dynamics, population aging, and the implications of that in 30 or 40 years' time for people's discretionary spending power, you know, it's quite complex, but tourism may become unaffordable to many people because of other financial commitments. There's a whole range of factors that I think in the short term, it would be ethically unjust to price people out of the market. But in the longer term, I think it will happen inevitably. Can't hear you, sorry, you're muted again.
Okay, thank you, Richard. We have lots of questions on COVID. So I will take the opportunity that you started.
Inevitably, yeah.
Yeah, so Professor Elimar asked, what's your opinion about the future of tourism after COVID? There is a question coming from YouTube on the same topic. A minute, I will find it. Yeah. The question is made by Daisy Maricato. So please, in your opinion, what's the future of tourism post-COVID? But there is one which I think you could add a little bit more, which is made by Ana Paula Jacques. The question is, with the pandemic, we can see lots of efforts of people to try to make that tourism market as the way it was before the pandemic. So Then she asks, are we missing an opportunity to promote a more sustainable tourism now, or do you think it's not in our hands?
Look, I mean, who knows, actually? Yes, I do have strong opinions. I have some ideas about what will happen post-COVID. We all know that many destinations have suffered terribly. We all know that some destinations have also recognised the sheer pleasure of having no tourists. The stories of dolphins being seen in the Venetian lagoon again, and how pleasant it is to be able to walk down the street, etc., etc., etc. There's also been a huge debate on TriNet. I don't know if colleagues in Brazil are on TriNet, it's the International Tourism Research Network. A lot of people have been asking or proposing that COVID is offering the opportunity to move to a future more sustainable, more just, more communities kind of focused form of tourism development. In an ideal world, that would be the case. In the real world, I don't think it will be the case. Something like 50 million jobs globally have been threatened by the COVID crisis, jobs in tourism. As we all know, tourism accounts for, 10% of global employment. It's a huge, huge sector. Here in the UK at the moment, we're currently in a lockdown in England at the moment. We're moving from next week into a new kind of more localized, tiered system of controls. The hospitality sector in this country is saying, you're killing us, with the system that's going to come in. Such is the, on the one hand, economic dependency on tourism and hospitality. When I talk about tourism, I'm talking about the hotel sector, restaurants, the whole hospitality tourism sector. That there is going to be so much pressure, so much need on the part of the tourism economy to rebuild, that in the short term there are going to be promotions, there's going to be marketing, they will be doing everything to bring business back. At the same time, the experience in Europe over the summer months, to very briefly summarize, Europe was pretty much in lockdown till about June, July, say June. And then the various governments of Europe, because of the impact on tourism, started building I'm not sure if you're aware of this, but there were all these air bridges between the UK and Germany and Spain and Portugal and Greece and everywhere else. And the pent-up demand for tourism was such that tourism exploded. Everybody went to these places, which has directly fed into the second wave of COVID in Europe. There is also the argument that because with lockdown, those people who are still fortunate to be working, like ourselves, we can work from home, we're still earning money, but we're not spending any money because we can't. So there's also the argument that many people are saving up money, and once lockdown or the COVID crisis comes to some form of conclusion, that everybody is going to want to spoil themselves, and they're going to go and spend all this money they've been saving up. And what do people do when they have discretionary money in their pockets and they wish to spoil themselves, they wish to enjoy themselves? They spend it on tourism. History shows when people begin to have more money, they spend it on tourism. So in an ideal world, it would be nice if we could learn from the reduction in tourism through COVID, that we could move to a more sustainable approach. I'm sure some destinations will. I'm convinced that some destinations, for example, Venice just, I think 2 days ago, announced they are going to actually introduce a charge on day visitors. They're going to charge day visitors, which will have some dampening on demand. Other destinations that were already looking to try and reduce tourism will probably, enhance those efforts from their experience of COVID. On a global level, I can't see that happening. What I see in the shorter term is an explosion of tourism, unfortunately. But in the longer term, as I was saying to Helena before, I just think the natural path that the tourism sector is going to have to follow in terms of expenditure and cost is that tourism will become more expensive in the medium term, which will have a dampening effect.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, this is a big discussion nowadays. About you were talking about the people are losing their jobs and actual people who survive out of tourism. Professor Michel from the University of Rio Grande do Norte has a question about it. He asks, how do you see the issue of residents' quality of life and the tourist experience when it comes to integration and segregation between tourists and residents in search of sustainability? I think there's a role of this integration and segregation, and this is very important for Brazil. The idea of segregation is something that is quite important for us. So please, if you could say something about it.
Well, I'm not familiar with the idea of segregate. Well, I mean,
disparity or separation, or
well, integration or segregation or integration of tourists from local communities. I mean, I understand where that kind of comes from, these ideas, because one of the biggest challenges emerging through over-tourism as well. Over-tourism has occurred to a great extent because of the sharing economy, peer-to-peer, Airbnb essentially, which has desegregated the tourism parts of cities and towns with urban areas. As we all know, a lot of private people rent out their apartments, and so the tourists are coming into residential areas, etc., etc. So that's the kind of the integration, and on a sort of sustainable community, just kind of from that perspective, you say, well, integration is quite a good thing, because if tourists and local residents can communicate, get together, that could lead to a more understanding kind of form of tourism. In an ideal world. In the real world, of course, it doesn't happen. So you then look at the other side, which is segregation, which is actually, although it sounds very negative to say, tourists and residents are segregated, that's how it's mostly happened in most cities and places around the world. That's how it is. Look at most tourist resorts around the world, beach resorts. You have all the hotels down one end of the bay, and you'll get the residential parts at the other end. Tourism and local communities have always been segregated, and it's perhaps that's the way how tourism has survived, because those two societies, if you like, have always been separate. Where they come together is when you have people who come to work in the sector, and but they tend to go away from the resort again. The ultimate, of course, which is in the Caribbean, being one of the most popular areas, are the all-inclusive resorts, which is the ultimate segregation of tourism from local residents. Which is best? I mean, that's a rhetorical question. I'm not expecting an answer. But you could argue in many senses that all-inclusive resort-based tourism is more sustainable in some senses than a more integrated community kind of tourism. As long as that the local community benefit from the tourism that is brought in through employment and so on and so forth. I wouldn't argue one way or another. It depends on the local destination, the kind of tourism that local destinations are interested in, what they seek to achieve through tourism. I just think there's some danger in putting types of tourism into silos, if you will, into categories, to say, the critical tourism people will always say we must have community focused tourism, and it's all got to be about integration between tourists and locals to get much more integration economically and culturally and in every single way. I actually have no problem with all-inclusive resorts in the correct context. I mean, I would say, I don't know if many of you there have ever heard of it. There's a very famous, infamous tourist resort in England called Blackpool. It's one of the old tourist resorts. I mean, it emerged in 1780 or 1800. It first was developed, and it's now it's very down market. It's very cheap and cheerful, but very popular still. But I would say that is probably the most sustainable resort, because everybody who lives and works in Blackpool, it's a tourism culture. They understand what the town is about. They understand the visitors. The visitors know themselves what they're going to get there in terms of their tourist experience. It's enclosed within a town, which is horrible, but nevertheless, lots of people go there. But it works. And all the impacts are, maintained within the town area. To my mind, that is a totally sustainable kind of tourist resort. It's completely opposite of what most people would think of in terms of sustainable tourism, but it is. So that's just something for you to think about.
Yeah, well, it's a very good criticism. No, it makes me think like, so it's not about the equipment, no, but how it is placed there. What is the history behind that equipment, which will say if it is sustainable or not?
Yeah.
Very interesting. Professor Sharpley, I think we are coming to the end of our meeting, so I will invite Elena to speak the final words and invite you for yours. So please, Elena.
So I would like first to thank you, everyone. Thank you, all of you, for the questions, and mainly thank Professor Sharpley for the very enriching answers. And I would like to invite you, since we are heading to the 5 last minutes, to give us your final words or your final message that you would leave with us.
Oh gosh. Well, the first thing I'd like to say, I mean, I'm sure there are lots of other questions people might wish to ask. So if you, Helena, or Mozart, if they want to collate questions, and then you can email me at some stage with those. I'll respond as best I can. But rather than everybody emailing me, if they come together, then
Okay.
I'm more than happy to do that. I'd also say that it's been a huge pleasure today to talk with you all, and to be able to answer your questions and to present my ideas. And I do hope, we've had questions about a post-COVID world, and I suppose the other thing I do have to say, in seriousness, is that, I'm very hypocritical because I love travel, and the one thing I would find very difficult, and this is part of the problem, I guess, is that I would find it very difficult to give up travel. So I would love to have the opportunity, for example, at some stage, if we could work to come and, do some work at your university, for example. So, but there is this hypocrisy because, on the one hand, we're talking about reducing consumption, but on the other hand, we still maintain our behaviours. So I think, we are all for a final comment, I suppose, we are all part of the problem as we are part of the solution. And I think, we do, rather than sitting in our academic ivory towers and sort of giving all these ideas about what other people must do, we need to think about what we will do as well, I think, as individuals. Whether I'm prepared to stop flying or whether I'm prepared to do things slightly differently. But I think whatever the answer, whatever the solutions, and it's not only about tourism and flying, it's about consumption as a whole, in all production and all consumption, in all forms. Whatever ideas we all have, without wanting to quote Greta Thunberg at all, but something does have to change, and change will happen because change will have to happen. And whether it's us or whether it's the Greta Thunberg generation, the younger people who bring that change, but certainly the way we're continuing, as Greta would say, making the same old mistakes again and again, which we are doing. The approach to the global economy, the approach to global development, in my view, has to change because it's unsustainable. And that's my final comment.
Thank you, Professor Sharpley. Thank you again. Thank you on behalf of our university, our research groups, our members. Thank you for sharing your thoughts with us. And I think what you're doing with us today, which is very, very important, is that you make us rebalance how we think about tourism, how we approach how it is consumed, produced, and managed. So I think it is very special for us to listen to you, that you love traveling. So I believe all of you love traveling and we love tourism. That's why we are dedicating our lives to make it better. So thank you very much for this opportunity. I hope everyone that is with us in YouTube has enjoyed. And for sure, for us, it's a great way for ending this semester and a way of thinking about complexity. I think you invite us to this. It's not a matter of having simple answers for such complex questions. So we integrate this complexity in our thoughts, and it's very important for all of us as researchers and tourism scholars. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you to our audience in YouTube, and we see each other in the next year. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.